There we go. I apologize to those who just listened to the recording. Tonight we're talking about what does welcoming new participants mean. So just a little bit about me. My pronouns are he, him, and il pour nos amis qui parlent français. I am a non-disabled cisgender Black man. With Inclusion Incorporate, I am the digital media and inclusion specialist, and I have the privilege of being a parent to Elijah, Kendra, and Hamilton the dog. I'm a settler in Mi'kmaq, which is commonly known today as Nova Scotia. And prior to my time in Inclusion Incorporated, I've spent the last 17 years or so working not only for our provincial government here on the East Coast, but also for various community, provincial, and national sport organizations. And in my spare time, when I'm not working, I have the pleasure of speaking with you folks. I'm the president and founder of an organization called the Black Rock Initiative, and we are working to make the sport of curling much more inclusive. So I'm a curler at heart. I've been curling now for 25 years. If you happen to be watching the Scotties Tournament of Hearts, you don't need to watch very long to realize that there's not a ton of diversity in sport, in that particular sport. And a lot of my examples tonight are going to be curling related. So with that said, let's get into it. So what are our outcomes for tonight? We're going to talk about understanding what is diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And then we're going to build on that understanding and start to think about how do we create change in our spaces and places that we control. Now, the reality is we only have 1 hour to cover these pieces, and we're not going to cover everything in a little bit of detail. If you have questions, I'm going to ask that you hold them until the end. Si vous avez des questions en français, je peux les répondre dans le chat en français, ce n'est pas de problème. And I'll also include my email address on the last slide that if you want to continue the conversation, by all means, please feel free to reach out via email. Now, I believe I had this in my last presentation that we talked about, but this is a mindset I want to have as we dive into this work. We want to do the best we can until we know better. And then once we know better, do better. So I'm not here to point the finger at you tonight or to say that you're a bad guy or a good person or anything like that. My hope is that I can provide you with a few more tools so that when you go back to your clubs, we can really dive into the work to make sailing a bit more inclusive. And I actually have a special little resource to be able to provide you folks at the end here when we get there. So when you see yellow, we're going to be doing a little bit of a participatory activity. Just for context, because we only have an hour, the participatory activities are going to be very short in nature and be more reflection pieces than participatory activities. Speaking of which, we're going to hop into one right now. So I want you to take the next 30 seconds or so and think about a time when you felt included or excluded. It can be on the water, it can be at work, it can be at the grocery store. It doesn't have to necessarily be sailing related. But let's think about a time when you felt included or excluded. And in that moment of inclusion or exclusion, how did that make you feel? So we're just going to take 30 seconds to think about that. So like I said, it's going to be quick tonight. So you ask, why did we just go through that quick little exercise? And the reason why we went through that exercise is because all of us, regardless of what background we come from, no matter what we look like, we all carry a bit of an invisible backpack, if you will. For some of us, that backpack is light. For others, that backpack could be heavy. Perhaps you just had a loved one pass away, somebody close to you pass away. Perhaps while you're at work today, you had a bad interaction with your boss or a coworker. But the reality is the way that backpack changes depending on a multitude of things. But for folks from underrepresented communities, especially racialized underrepresented communities, how heavy that backpack can be simply based on their individual identity, simply based on the fact that they are indigenous or they are Black or they are a newcomer. or they come from any sort of country, doesn't really matter. The reason why I bring this up is because what we want is to not only know better and do better, but what I hope for is that we can create an environment on the water and within our sailing clubs where when a participant shows up, whether they are from the 2S LGBTQ plus community, whether they're Black, Indigenous, et cetera, that they're able to take that backpack off, whether it's for a couple of hours, whether it's for a day, whether it's for a weekend, and simply be able to participate, simply be able to sail. And at an absolute minimum, whether we are in St. John's or whether we are in Victoria, that is what we should be striving for, to be able to create systems and spaces and places where that invisible backpack, we can take that off and be our true and authentic self. So just a little something to think about as we go through this presentation. So let's get into a little bit about why this work is important to me and talk about a cycle that I hope Sail Canada clubs and organizations will avoid. The reality is that traditional systems, and sports for that matter, aren't designed for a number of people. Specifically as it relates to most sports, there's a number of different clubs and facilities, not with any harm intended, but haven't done the work in terms of being as inclusive as we potentially could be. In the sport of curling, I've been having these conversations for the better part of a decade. So when I give these examples, I'm not picking on sailing in particular, it's across a number of different sports. Historically, what happens is when we go through presentations such as the one we're having today, the knowledge seems new or seems different to somebody. And then historically, what has happened is this creates defensiveness and a rejection to make change. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about this evening is a level of discomfort, a level of unlearning that takes place with these. And I encourage you to sit in that discomfort and to sit in that learn as we go and create and foster change within our clubs and within our facilities. Because it's not always comfortable, and quite frankly, it's not always the easiest thing to do, but it's so very important to be able to create a facility where everybody can show up and be their authentic self. Because if we're not being as inclusive as we can be, the reality is the club or your facility isn't as safe as it should be. Now let's talk about an experience life cycle, and I'm going to relate this specifically to curling only because I've only been sailing a couple of times with good old Frank Denny from Sail, Nova Scotia, and when you hang out with Frank, folks just move out of your way. But let's talk about the experience life cycle for a moment. Typically, we have the honeymoon phase where everybody's welcoming, everybody feels happy. There's a person with a difference, whether it be physical, whether it be biological, who enters that space. Oftentimes, when they are the first or the only, there's a level of tokenization that can take place because the space itself is not designed for them to be able to show up and be their true and authentic self. We may try. That doesn't mean that there's somebody at the door saying, being racist or discriminatory, saying, no, you can't come in. But what happens over time is this microaggressions, which we're going to talk about in a future presentation, and repetitive injury. I don't talk about physical injury, but I'm talking about psychological safety, which we are going to get into in this presentation. Then there's the burden of change. So for myself being a curler, when I first started curling and I would have microaggressions come my way, or sometimes even some severe racial slurs, I would think of ways to change that space to make it feel a bit more welcoming for folks who look like me and work up the energy, get past the nervousness to be able to present them. Then what would often happen is there's a level of confrontation that takes place. When the individual tries to explain how they felt, folks struggle to understand because they've never felt excluded in that space. The sport has always been a safe space for them. This then leads to denial and attack, so their experience is denied and rationalized, and sometimes it can even turn to, well, this problem is your fault. And then with sport, especially, what happens is that individual just leaves and then look for that sense of belonging somewhere else. Here for a second. we'll skip over this video because I want to continue on to the belonging continuum. So here's the thing about belonging. Belonging is about creating spaces and places not where people can fit in. That's the opposite of belonging. Belonging shouldn't require the participant to change who they are. It's the system, it's the program, it's the club, it's the sport that needs to change how they've historically operated. Belonging is going to be a focus this evening / this afternoon, so let's dive into it a little bit further. On your screen here is the belonging continuum framework from a group called the Change Catalyst based in the United States. At the beginning stages of belonging is diversity. When we look at what most organizations do when building on this, is we have acquired diversity, which refers to characteristics that individuals gain or acquire through life experiences, education, training, or exposure to different cultures and perspectives. Consider this as one person's lived experience, if you will. There's also acquired diversity, which refers to the characteristics that an individual are born with or possess inherently, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or age. Inherent diversity focuses on traits that are integral to an individual's identity and are not subject to change. As we move along, we have psychological safety. And what psychological safety is, it's the belief that the environment is safe for interpersonal risk-taking without fear of humiliation, retaliation, or reprisal, Simply put, when we take away, a number of big words, if you will, it's the moment that the individual begins to feel that they will not be harmed mentally by participating. As we treat the participant as an individual and begin to celebrate their differences versus trying to get them to conform to the norm, that participant begins to engage in a meaningful way in the activity. As these opportunities increase, so it's not just a one-off, but as these opportunities increase, so does the likelihood that the participant will commit to being part of the activity for the foreseeable future. And this is what inclusion looks like. Though we're going to define it a bit in a moment, if we are creating spaces and places that have inclusion at its core, we will have belonging. Just a little bit of framework as we get into this conversation. So let's go into a little bit about some terms here. When we talk about diversity, by definition, diversity is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a wide range of different social and ethnic backgrounds, different genders, different sexual orientations, etc. But the reality is you can be unintentionally diverse. If you take a look at your grocery store, you will see folks from every walk of life, most likely. But the local grocery store didn't put up a sign about intentionally being diverse. It's because they're in a local grocery store. We see this a lot in sport too. In hockey, where I do some diversity inclusion work with the local provincial sport association, we see diversity, but that's because folks want to participate. It's not necessarily because that minor hockey association has done anything intentional. So you can be unintentionally diverse. Diversity is not just something that we should be checkmarking as a box, if you will. The other thing to remember with diversity is that having an open door isn't enough. I have this conversation all the time with curling facilities. The idea of if I can walk into the curling facility, I will be welcomed no matter what happens, and I'm able to participate. But I want you to imagine for a moment, you hop on the plane, you get off that plane a few hours later, and when you take a look around, nobody around you looks like you. And you feel you can't relate to anybody around you because perhaps they're speaking a different language. And perhaps they look very different. The reality is, unless we are extremely extroverted, if you will, most likely the reaction from that individual is, this isn't a space and place where I think I'm going to be able to participate, whether that's true or not, and they're most likely to leave. When we talk about achieving diversity, you need to achieve creating a safer space. In a past life, I spent time working with the Canadian Sport Institute Atlantic, specifically with coaches and provincial sport organizations. And the question I would get often is, Andrew, we need to make sport XYZ more diverse. But what I would say to that is we're asking the wrong question. Diversity is a byproduct of what we're trying to achieve. Because, like I said earlier, it's what we see on the surface. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make the sport more inclusive. So what is inclusion? Inclusion is the effort and practices in which different groups or individuals have different backgrounds and are culturally, and socially accepted and welcome. Inclusion is being intentional. Inclusion is the work. Being inclusive could mean creating an inclusion policy for your organization. So it's one thing to have in your rules and regulations that racism and discrimination will not be tolerated. Most organizations have some form of that within your rules and regulations. But diving in a bit more as to why that is, that's when we start to take the beginning steps towards an inclusion policy. And that's just one simple example. And then next we get into equity. So the tools, processes, structures, and programs. Equity recognizes that each person comes from different circumstances, faces different barriers, and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. Equity and equality are not the same thing. We're going to dive into that a little bit more in a moment. But when we create programs with an equity lens, they will eventually be equitable across the board, which means eventually we can achieve meaningful equality. And once that's achieved and we maintain that as best we can through inclusive practices and policies, we're now being inclusive. And if we're intentionally being inclusive, we will see meaningful diversity within our clubs and facilities. When equity, inclusion, and diversity are working together in this cycle, it means that everyone within our facilities and within our programs feels that sense of belonging. When we talk about belonging, belonging is the feeling of being happy or comfortable as part of a regular group and having a good relationship with other members of that group because they welcome and accept you. Let's forget about sport for a moment. We as human beings, we crave that sense of belonging. We need that sense of belonging. Some folks find it through religion. Some folks, quite frankly, find it through politics. Some folks find it through work. But this is where we need to strive towards, because if we can create spaces and places on the water where people truly feel a sense of belonging, that's when we can really see meaningful diversity within the sport of sailing. So let's talk about 3 different types of diversity, because diversity, as we dive into a little bit further, can be a little, not complicated, but a little bit different. So when we talk about demographic diversity, what we're talking about is our inherent characteristics like race, gender, ethnicity, and identity. When we get into life experiences, we're talking about, what we've experienced in our lives from our interactions with others, hobbies where we grew up, visited, languages we speak, basically our lived experiences, like I chatted about earlier. And then we have cognitive diversity, which refers to the differences in how individuals think, perceive information, solve problems, and make decisions. It encompasses a variety of cognitive styles, perspectives, approaches, and knowledge bases within a group or organization. So what I'm trying to say, in not so many words, is diversity is a bit more than what we can immediately see. So I'm just want to skip to this slide here first, and then I'm going to go back to the will, power, and privilege. But one thing I want you to think about as we reflect on this presentation this evening is what tables exist within your organization's ecosystems. At these tables of power and decision-making, what types of diversity do you currently have there? And then when we look at that, what types of diversity are you missing from these rooms? With a particular focus on what it is that you do. So perhaps you're a youth-based organization, just as the example says there, You want to have youth in advisory positions. When we create programs that are more inclusive, we want to have folks from that community, from those communities at the table, if you will. Now, let me go back here, if you will. Because we have the wheel of power and privilege, and this comes from a woman by the name of Sylvia Duxworth. This isn't necessarily my drawing or design, but I do want to talk about it because I like this on a number of different fronts. As a big black guy, quite frankly, when I talk about underrepresented or marginalized groups, folks immediately assume that I'm referring to race. But the reality is that we know that those who have a disability, whether we can see that disability or not, typically have a lesser sport experience than those who are we consider to be able-bodied. We know that individuals from the 2S LGBTQ plus community typically have a lesser sport experiences than those who are considered heterosexual or straight. We know that those who come from a low socioeconomic environment typically have a lesser sport experience than those who do not. The reality is when we talk about marginalization, we're talking about more than just what we mentioned earlier, what we can actually see. And historically, what we've seen in sport, not necessarily with ill intent, especially today, but those who have the power, those who have the ability to influence decisions, typically do not come from underrepresented communities. In order to create meaningful change, like we talked about earlier, and I'm going to go back to this slide here. If we want to create meaningful change, those who have lived experiences, those from the communities in which we're trying to attract to Salem, we have to have their voice at the table. Because it's then that we can begin to ask questions. It's then that we can begin to dismantle barriers and have a true understanding of what the barriers are for those individuals and those communities. When we look at inclusion, inclusion is being intentional. So inclusion doesn't erase an individual's identity. So it's not about I don't see color. And I don't see color is problematic for a couple of different reasons. Number one, the reality is that we do see color. But when we treat everybody the same, we're not celebrating and acknowledging that person's differences. When we look at inclusion at its core, especially in the world of sport and recreation, if you forget everything, if you forget what I look like, you forget my name, you forget who I work for, okay, fine, whatever. But I hope that you take away this. Inclusion at its core, when we boil it down to its simplest form, is the love that you have for sailing. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say if you're joining me at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on a Tuesday night, you at least very much like the sport of sailing, if not love the sport of sailing. So that love that you have, or that strong like that you have, inclusion is passing that on to others while acknowledging and celebrating their differences. Now, of course, as we dive into it, it gets a bit more complicated, but at its core, that's what we're talking about. Passing on your love of the sport to others while celebrating their differences. But when we talk about inclusion, my hope is that we, in the future, we look at inclusion from a systems lens rather than a marketing lens. Oftentimes, I see sports and recreation in particular look at newcomers, just as an example, as folks that they need to market to better. Or they look at indigenous folks as groups that need to market to better. But inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into the systems and structures that exist. It's not about, like we talked about earlier, it's not about fitting in. It's about changing the system, programs, and structures so that everyone is welcome and everybody can be their true and authentic self. And like I talked about earlier, this benefits everybody. that individual within your club who's a bit more introverted, are we doing everything possible so that they can show up and be their authentic self? That little girl or that woman who everybody considers to be a nerd, or most folks consider to be a nerd, are we doing everything possible so that she can show up and be their authentic self? Because, like I said, when we show up and be our authentic self in whatever shape or form that takes place, so long as we're not hurting ourselves or somebody else, what difference does it make? What harm is caused by having individuals show up and be their authentic self? Just a little something to think about. When we talk about inclusion, I divide it up into these 4 sections, if you will. So we start with compassion. So showing empathy, not sympathy, because those are 2 different things, but showing empathy to others. Compassion can also present itself in acknowledging that your club or organization hasn't done enough to ensure that sailing is as inclusive as it could be. It is okay, and quite frankly, in my opinion, in the research that I've done in this IDE space, it's important to acknowledge that there is work to be done. That doesn't mean that you are a bad person or you are a bad organization. It just means there's more work to be done. And that's okay to say out loud. When we get into collaboration, we're talking about working with and for different communities to ensure everybody is able to show up. So when we talk about collaboration, that's when we talk about having those different types of diversity at the table. That's when we talk about working directly with community, like we talked about in our last presentation as well. To create a program for the community, we have to work with the community. Next there in green is choice. So providing various options on how to participate within sailing. There can be more than one way we can allow everyone to participate and belong. And that's okay. And then there's the curiosity. So asking questions and actively listening, not listening to respond, but actively listening to those who are trying to serve. Oftentimes, as human beings, when somebody's explaining to us something, or somebody's telling us about something, we already have our retort or what we're going to say in the back of our head and mind. And once we have that ingrained in the back of our mind, we're not really fully listening to what that individual is saying. And we need to be able to do a little bit less of that and actively listen a bit more. With the Black Rock Initiative, which I talked about earlier, what we do is we create opportunities for BIPOC youth to experience the sport of curling, while also working with curling clubs and facilities so that we can provide them with tools and resources so they can be a welcoming facility to their entire community. When we start with all 3 of our programs, the first question that we would ask our community partner is, what does the sport of curling look like to your community? So when we partner with the Boys and Girls Club of Preston, which is in East Preston, which is one of the largest Black communities, not only in Nova Scotia, but in Canada, we would ask the question, what does curling look like in your community? And the response that we got initially was, well, the sport of curling, only watched it a couple of times, but it's not a sport for Black people. It's a sport for old, rich, white people. Now, when we hear negative things about a sport, we initially want to get into this defensive stage and say, well, that's not the case. But in reality, when we start to work with community, and that's the response we get back, or a similar type of response, that becomes the reality in which we're working. And it's up to us as leaders to build trust, to build a relationship with our community partners, to work to dismantle those barriers, whether they are perceived or otherwise. And then through that building of relationship, that building of trust, we can eventually have a program. We can eventually work to create a more inclusive program or club. So like I mentioned earlier, equity and equality is not the same thing. Perhaps you've seen this diagram or a very similar diagram before where of three individuals trying to look over the fence and watch the baseball game. The reality is quite often, one person gets more than what's needed while the other person gets less than, and thus a disparity is created. Here in Nova Scotia, we have these individuals who work in schools called African Nova Scotian student support workers. And they are there to support every African Nova Scotian, every Black Nova Scotian be able to work through their barriers so that they can succeed and graduate. So in grade 4, my son, Elijah, who's biracial, came home with this laptop in his backpack. Now, being in grade 4, he's now in grade 11, and I'm sure he loves the fact that I'm telling this story, but it's neither here nor there. It's part of the gig when I do this type of work. So being in grade 4, there's any number of ways that laptop got into his backpack. So I say, Elijah, how did that laptop get into your backpack? And he said, well, my African student support worker gave it to me. And I said, well, why did he give it to you? And he said, well, because he met with the principal and together they determined that every Black or brown student in our school needed a laptop to make sure that we got our homework done. And as he's saying this, I look over my shoulder at this brand new computer that we just got for the whole family. While well-intentioned, the principal and the African Nova Scotian student support worker were well-intentioned. That was looking at a problem through a lens of equity. So meaning providing everyone with the same amount of resources, whether or not they need them. And like we talked about earlier, equity recognizes that each person comes from different circumstances, faces different barriers, and allocates those exact resources and opportunities needed. Simply put, it's a whole lot of words for saying that not all Black people are the same. Not all men are the same. Not all women are the same. And when we start to create programming and looking at a community as a monolith or as the same, we lose the opportunity to actively listen. We lose the opportunity to create solutions through that equity lens so that everybody can get the supports that they need, which eventually produces equity. When we talk about equity, there's two different ways that we can look at this. We see scaffolding. Now, while scaffolding can be great in educational situations, in sport and recreation, so in sports sailing, it's a starting point as a temporary or band-aid fix for programming or policy, as it adds to the existing policy rather than change it at its core. So when we look at scaffolding, when we look at what the Black Rock Initiative is doing, I mean, I'm biased because I help run the organization, but we're not doing anything to change the sport at its core. We're creating a bit of an off-ramp, if you will, for members of the BIPOC community to be able to participate in the sport of curling. Where we want to get to is we want to get to universal design. Change can start with scaffolding, but it's only one piece of the solution. Universal design takes more time, but ideally it's what we want to achieve. We want our programs, facilities, and policies to be accessible to all, regardless of their identity. In universal design, there's multiple paths to access, with those paths being built in consultation with the community. Now, if you have an awesome program within your club or facility, I don't want to say that that's bad. But what I'm trying to say is that that is just one step in creating a more inclusive program. So we have a program perhaps for newcomers that comes up. We can celebrate that. We can give thumbs up. We can have a piece of cake. But then we move on the next day to talk about how can we make this program even better. Speaking of where to start, I want to be able to give you some tools and give you a bit of a starting point on where to start. So this is the system that we've used here in Inclusion Incorporated, and we divide this into 4 steps. So first on the far left is understand. So understand the barriers that exist. And that's looking internally first. So I always say, in order to be able to support others, in order to eventually get to a space of meaningful inclusion, we have to clean our own house first. So in this example, gender identification on forums doesn't align with gender identification. So then it's one thing to understand the barriers, but we have to eventually get started and do some work here. But we don't need to change everything all at once. Let's start with some simple changes and progress, to larger changes. So having registration forms that are are a bit more inclusive of gender. And then we can eventually get to a space where we can target. So target systems and structures that are maintained, that use, to maintain the system, the status quo. So in this case, creating a gender inclusion policy that eventually gets into addressing change in culture. Because a lot of times when we look at sport, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more with our next session, sexism, which I'm going to get to in a moment, it's more than just making a tweak here, a tweak there. It's about changing the culture of our sport. It's about changing the culture of sailing so that it can be truly inclusive for everybody, so that everybody can show up and be their authentic self without fear of harm, whether that's psychological or otherwise. And then we get into a space of include, where we're involving diverse voices as input. So not only offering it up for review before finalizing, but also as we go through the start and target stages, inviting folks in for opportunities for feedback. Because feedback, when used correctly, only makes our changes even better. So now let's get into planning a little bit. So how do we do this? So as we start to think about this, what are some equitable adaptations that we can make in the spaces and places where you can control? Not how can we write the world's longest email to Nick and talk about a multitude of changes that Sail Canada can do. But what are some adaptations that you can make within the spaces and places that you can control? And then as we think about this, what barriers exist? How do you find out what barriers exist? And whose voices should be centered in this process? Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a moment. If I click the right button here, stop sharing, there we go. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to drop into the chat a file that you can download and use. And if you're struggling to download this file, by all means, reach out to me and I can email it to you directly. But what this is, it's a file that has these resources in a fillable PDF. So if I open the PDF and share my screen again, I hope you can all see that chart there. So this is a fillable PDF that you can take back to your club and facility and start to think about what are some of those first steps. So as we understand, start, target, and include, what is it that we're trying to do? So you can fill this out, and with each barrier, we can fill this out multiple times. And then we have some spaces and places here on the form that we talk about what are some equitable adaptations that you can make in your spaces and places. And these forms, like I said, are completely fillable. We can write right in them. So I encourage you to download that form that I just put into the chat and to share that with your club and facilities. And like I said, if for whatever reason, if you're like myself and aren't the most technical savvy in the whole wide world, by all means, feel free to email myself, email Nick, and we'll be sure to get that to you. Now, let's hop back to the presentation here. Look at that. My wife would be so proud that I've gone back and forth from one thing to the other in Zoom. So before I set time for questions, I want to talk briefly about our next session. So 2 weeks from tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, we're going to talk about sailing beyond sexism, navigating gender equity challenges in sport. Now, Nick and I, we chatted about this, and rather than have a man go through a presentation and have this conversation with you, which is problematic on a number of different levels, we're going to have a panel discussion with 4 women who have a background in sailing, and we're going to introduce them to you during next session. So a little bit of a tease there, if you will. Well, I have questions for that panel discussion, and while those lovely individuals, they're going to share some great stories and some ways to think about how to create change. I encourage you to submit your questions as well. Start thinking about those questions. If you don't want to, for whatever reason, say a question out loud during this panel discussion, you can email these questions to whether it's to myself by email, andrew@inclusionincorporated.com, or to nick@sailing.ca. This is really a conversation that I'm looking forward to, and I hope that you're able to join us in a couple of weeks. That's Wednesday, March 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So that's all I got. Thank you very much for your time. I hope as you reflect on this evening that we reflect on this through the lens of start, stop, continue. So what's one thing based on this conversation you're going to start doing? What's one thing based on this conversation this evening you're going to stop doing? And what's one thing based on this conversation you're going to continue to do? And through that, we can make meaningful change, because it only takes one step, one small change that can then ripple into a large number of changes. So my question for you this evening, as you reflect, not only is start, stop, continue, but what is your ROI? What is your ripple of impact? Because when one ripple, by dropping that pebble into the water, it creates that ripple. And through that one action, that one drop in the pebble, it's almost impossible to see what is the impact that we'll have down the road in the future. And I can tell you, as an individual who's played a number of different sports, the only reason why I've been able to get to where I am today is because I've had others drop that pebble into the water to create a ripple of impact to be able to, for have me be able to get to where I am today. So with that said, I'm going to stop talking right now. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to open the floor up to any questions you might have.